Morning, everyone.
Good morning, Rabbi.
We're learning Mishna is Erevin, Parakimel, chapter 3. Excuse me, Mishnah Aleph, Mishnah 1. Okay. Bakol Ma'arvin Mishtatvin. One can make an Erev or make a Shituf, we'll explain what that means soon, with any type of food, Chutz min hamayim min hamelech, except for water or salt. or salt. Now, the Erev we're talking about here is an Erev Tchumen. Erev Tchumen means the Torah, we have a prohibition to go more than 2,000 cubits away from our residence. Now, that can include, your residence includes your city and plus that. We just said for convenience sake, let's just call it 2,000 cubits from your residence, because if you're living out in the forest, you'd have 2,000 cubits from your house. So if let's say you need to go more than those 2,000 cubits on Shabbos, what do? So it's called an Erev Tchumen. That means before Shabbos, you go out 2,000 cubits, and you put food down. And when you put the food down there, that now becomes your residence for Shabbos. And right now, if that's residence for Shabbos, you've got 2,000 cubits in all directions from that point. So you what?
In addition.
I didn't say in addition. In addition.
Well, yeah.
But the truth is, even your house, you have 2,000 cubits in all directions.
Yeah.
The point is that when you now establish a residence in the new part, not that you're sleeping there at night on the ground, but basically your residence is considered from there. You've got 2,000 cubits from there, which really means that when it comes to your house, you've kind of lost your ability to go before the Erev Tchumen. You can go from your house 2,000 cubits in all directions. Now you can't do that anymore. You can only go 2,000 cubits from where you put the food down.
Okay.
But that's the Erev Tchumen.
So you can't go beyond your house on the other side.
No, you cannot. Okay. Now, we will be discussing that eventually. But here the point is that when you make that Erev, the Mishnah says you can use all types of food. Umishtatvim. Shitav means you make a partnership. Mm-hmm. Partnership here means that similar to what we discussed by a chutzner, that when you have a number of houses open to a chutzner, you got to make an Erev Chatzeris before you can carry in the chutzner from the houses to the chutzner, from the chutzner to the houses. The same thing works because the setup was that you had your houses open to courtyards, and the courtyards were opened up to a mavli, to alleyways. Now, these alleyways were actually a rishus hayachad, a private domain, according to Torah law. But since all the chatzeris, all the courtyards were open into it, you have to treat it like a public domain unless you did the same thing that you do by Erev Chatzeris. You basically collect food from all the people of the Chatzer, of all the different Chatzeros, all the different courtyards. You put the food in one courtyard, and now everybody is like in that one courtyard, and everybody now can use. You can carry from the courtyard to the alleyway and back and forth. Here too, what do you do it with? You do it with food. So we say, whether it's the Erev Tchumen, whether it's the Shetufei Mevuos, the partnering of the courtyards in the alleyway, you can use any food except for water and salt. Mm-hmm. Now, what's with the water and salt? So in the notes here, they bring down that water and salt are not food because they are not served as a main course or a side dish. And therefore, these things are not called food in the context of Erev Tchumen or Erev or the Shetufim Mevuos. If your food is going to be if we say that your residence is where your food is, then basically it can't just be any food. It's got to be a food of some kind of significance. And that significance is whether you would eat it as a main course or as a side dish. Mm-hmm. The Baratunura says there's something also included that would be, even though it only says except water and salt, there's something else that's also excluded, and that is mushrooms. Mushrooms are also excluded. Mushrooms, I get in the times in Mishna, I guess, mushrooms were not typically eaten like a regular food.
Especially poison.
And poison is a different story. Yeah. But even the edible ones, these things were not eaten as either a main dish or a side dish. I guess a little bit different nowadays, maybe you could say. But at least in the times of the Mishnah, they were not, and therefore you couldn't make the Erev or the Shetufim Mevuos. Now, what's interesting to point out is that we mentioned, I only mentioned the Erev Chatzeris to help us understand what the shitufa mevuos was. But when it says here that you can use any type of food for an Erev Tchumen or for a shitufa mevuos, that's not true by an Erev Chatzeres. Erev Chatzeres got to use bread. Everybody's got to donate bread to the Erev. Okay, now next. V'akol nikach bekesef meiser. Anything can be acquired with meiser money. The meiser money here means we know there is an obligation to take off meiser sheni, the second tithing, meaning after we go ahead and we take off from our new grain, we take off truma for the kayin, and then we go ahead and we take off the what's from left after that. We take off a tenth for the Levi, and after that we take off a second tenth. The second tenth, what do you have to do with it? You got to eat in Yerushalayim. If you can't schlep it to Yerushalayim, redeem it onto money. You spend the money on food in Yerushalayim. So here, I'll call nikach bekesef meiser. Anything can be bought with meiser money. Chutz minamay minamelach. Here again, the exception is you cannot use it to buy water, no bottled water, using your meiser sheni money, and you don't buy salt with it. Now, why? What's the story? Why can't you buy those things with meiser sheni money? The answer is because we derive from the words of the Torah that what you use your meiser money for has to be the wording is menasatek. It has to be pre. It has to be a fruit from a fruit, which is explained to mean that it has to be something that reproduces fruit from a fruit, and it grows from the ground. Which, if it's a plant, it grows from the ground. If it's an animal, it eats from the ground. And but these water and salt don't meet any of these conditions, and therefore you cannot use them. You cannot buy meiser sheni money. You cannot buy meiser sheni money with them. Next case. Somebody makes a vow to abstain from mazain. Now, mazain they translate here as nourishing food. Mutter b'mayim v'velach is permitted to drink water and to eat salt. He made a very strict vow here, right? He made a vow from mazain. Mazain is going to include everything except for the water and the salt. Now, the word mazain, the way the Bartenura explains it is that there's actually a word mazan and there's a word zun. Mazain actually means something that really fills you and satiates you like bread. That's not what it means here. Here, because it says, because if that's what you actually made a vow on from what's called mazain, you'd be able to eat a lot more things than just the water and the salt. The wording that he actually says is that he's nadar midavar hazun. He makes a vow from anything that is zun. Zun means it temporarily satisfies you. And water and salt don't do that, and therefore the vow does not include the water or the salt. Next, ma'arvin la nazar bayan l'Yisrael b'truma. You're making an erev tchumen, right? Now the erev tchumen is going to be, it has to be food. What if that's a food you can't eat? You're a nazar, can't drink wine. Can you make an erev tchumen with wine? I mean, the food is supposed to be your residence place, but I can't eat from this food. So is it enough just to be food? It's got to be a food, or it's got to be something that you can partake of. So the Mishnah says, the first opinion of the Mishnah goes that even though the Nazir cannot drink wine, but somebody else can drink wine, it's food. You can use it for your Erev Tchumen. The same thing. Yisrael wants to put down Truma. He didn't give it to the Kayin yet. So he wants to take Truma. He wants to put it down for his Erev Tchumen. Can that work? He can't eat it. But a Kayin can eat it, and therefore the Tanakhama says, the first opinion says, you can use it for your Erev Tchumen. Simchas Omer Bachulin. Simcha says, no, you got to use Chulin. Simcha says, you cannot use Truma. The fact that a Kohen would be able to eat it doesn't help you. You can't eat it, therefore it's not considered a food for you for Erev Tchumen. Now, the point the Bartenura points out that Sumchas, when he argues, all he says is you got to use chulin. That means that's clearly not truma. But what about the nazar and the wine? Chulin is not a word to use to say that he can't use wine, and therefore the Bartenura says Sumchas doesn't argue by the nazar. The nazar wants to use wine for his Erev Tchumen, it's going to work, and that's because a nazar, if he wanted to, it would be possible, at least for him. Excuse me. He could end his Naziris. He could find a way to ask for a nullification, the same way you annul a vow. He could annul his Naziris. And were he to do that, he'd be able to partake from it. Okay? And apparently this is even something, just one second. Yeah, apparently he can do this on Shabbos. You can put it. You can do it on Shabbos, and therefore it's possible for him. Meaning you have to not be a Nazir anymore, but you would be able to drink this wine on Shabbos if you were to get an annulment for your Naziris, and therefore Simchas agrees that for a Nazir, wine can work for Erev Tchumen. The thing is, by Truma, the Bartanura points out that, if you made Truma and you made a mistake, like you didn't mean to make the Truma, you could go to a Chacham and get that annulled also. It's not a good word, annulled, but the bottom line is you can change, you can whatever, you can take off its status of Truma. So if so it seems like the same thing that us can do with wine, the Yisrael can do with Truma. The thing is, though, says about Tanura, let's say you do that. So what's going to happen to that grain? It's going to become tevel. You can't eat it anyway. Meaning you're stuck. You cannot eat this. Whether it's Truma or whether it's not Truma, you can't eat it. The point is that Kayin could, but that's not enough for Simchas.
Yeah. For
Simchas, it's not enough that somebody else could. If you can't, there's no way for you to. Simchas says you can't use it for Erev Tchumen. The thing is that it's possible for the Nazir to drink the wine, for this person to drink the wine, but there's no way that you, the Yisrael, can eat this Truma, because even if you take off the status of Truma from it, it's going to revert to being Tevel. Mishna says, Ula Kayin bebeis hapras. Now, this Kayin, you have a Kayin, okay? He decided, for some reason, to put his Erev Tchumen in a cemetery. Now, it wasn't really a cemetery. Not really a cemetery. It's called the Beis HaPras.
Yes.
A Beis HaPras is an area where you plowed up the area. There's a grave there, but you don't know where the grave was.
Right.
So the assumption has to be that when you plowed up the grave, that you now scattered a lot of bone fragments all over the place. And therefore, it's treated typically like a cemetery. Mm-hmm. However, the Chachamim allowed, now again, but this is a rabbinic restriction. So the Chachamim allowed for certain circumstances for a person to be able, for a Kayin, let's say, to be able, or even a regular person, let's say a regular person's got to get to Yerushalayim to Shech his Korban Pesach. And he's got to walk through this Beis HaPras to get there in time. Mm-hmm. But if he walks to the Beis HaPras, he's making himself tamei. So what does he do? So you do like this. You go through the cemetery and you bend down and you blow. Mm-hmm. And as you blow the dirt away, if there's any fragments, they'll be uncovered and you'll be able to be careful not to touch them. And therefore, we say, so that's what it means here too. The Kayin, if he puts his Erev down in the Beis HaPras, and we say, well, he can't get to his food. Here, the question is not the food itself being a problem. Here, the problem is you can't get to your food. You have no access to the food, right? Let me just read you here the introduction. Besides being fit to eat, the food of an Erev Tchumen must be in a place that the owner can access. Mm-hmm. All right, you want it to be a residence, you got to be able to access it. The Mishna discussed, okay, so now you have the Kayin, and the Kayin put it in a place where seemingly he can't get to. So the Tanna Kama says, look, if he puts it in a Beis HaPras, then he can get there. And therefore, he would be able it therefore can work as an Erev Tchumen for him. Rabbi Yehuda says, Afilu Beis HaKvaris, not just a Beis HaPras, you could put the food down in a cemetery, a regular full-fledged cemetery. How can you do that? Because he'd be able to go make a partition between himself and the graves and then eat the Erev. Now, what would he do? So let me read to you over here how they explain. One who passes over a grave contracts tumah from it. A Kohen is therefore prohibited from entering a cemetery because he will certainly walk over a grave. There's no dead pieces or anything around there. It's a question of going over a grave. Yeah. The Mishnah means that a Kohen can be carried into a cemetery in a large box or similar container, which serves as a barrier that blocks the tumah from him. Put the guy in a box, carry him through carry him through. It seems that he'd be able to somehow or another get the food. I guess maybe somebody will hand it to him. I don't know exactly from, over and inside. But the point is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, you, the Kayin, you can get into this cemetery. Yeah. You could get in. And since you could get in, so therefore it's accessible to you. Mm-hmm. And therefore he says, even if the Kayin puts their Tchumen down in a cemetery, it's going to work because that's called having access. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem is that if this Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, Rabbi Yehuda says, excuse me?
I mean,
Doesn't have to happen. What do you mean?
So
it's a Shusay Yachid.
It is okay. So he can
climb into the box.
Climb into the box, and then
I guess
that's
so.
what they do with the Miron, don't they? They make a box around them, and they can go into the
Innova case here too.
Somehow
Innova case.
So basically, there's ways of doing it. There's ways of doing it. They put them in a box, and you can do it. And get it to Rosh Hashanah. What's the big deal?
Mm-hmm.
Now, but the fact that Rabbi Yehuda says it like this, Rabbi Yehuda says, meaning that we brought down, when we started discussing access, the first opinion said, Kain and Beis Apras, no mention of a cemetery. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, cemetery. So there's clearly, even a cemetery rather. So it's from the way the Mishna is set up, there seems to be a machlokes here, seems to be an argument. Okay. The Bartanor brings down that the argument is not specifically about a Kain. Meaning the Tanakhama says a Kain, a Beis Apras, not a regular cemetery. Yehuda says no, even a regular cemetery, because the way the Rabbi Yehuda sets it up, that even Rabbi Yehuda says the Kain's accessibility is going to be through the box. Why wouldn't the Tanakhama hold to that? So the Bartanor brings down this from the Gemara that really the machlokes here is not really about a Kain. It's not a question about a Kain only putting it down in a Beis HaKvaris in a cemetery, and therefore, well, how does he have access? Says Rabbi Yehuda, I'll give him access, no big deal. It's anybody, really. The question is, even someone who's not a Kain, who can walk into that cemetery, and make Kiddush and eat in the cemetery, right? There's a question as to whether you can do that. Now, what's the issue? You can walk in the cemetery, can't you? Yes, but the problem is like this. The problem is that basically you're putting the food in the cemetery. No.
All right.
No. It's still halachically edible. There are people who eat in cemeteries. I think they still do it. I'm not sure.
I made a mistake. All right.
I think there's still people who, when they have a yard site and they daven by the kever there, I think they eat something there. No, I'm not sure. It's not usser. It's not usser. So the question is like this: when you put your food down on a grave, that's what you're doing. It's a cemetery, right? And you're basically leaving your food there. You're kind of storing your food there. You're using the grave to hold your food. Now that you use a grave, grave is asur bana. It's forbidden to have personal benefit from it. So therefore, the thing is like this: when you make your erev tchumen, you put the food down, right? When does the erev tchumen take its effect? When does the food that you put down there do its thing? Before Shabbos, not on Shabbos. Before Shabbos, before Shabbos begins, this becomes your place of residence. And then on Shabbos, you can move on. What happens if the food gets eaten after Shabbos? Let's say on Shabbos, an animal comes by and eats it. It's not a problem. It's not a problem. Because you already set up your place of residence before Shabbos. And so if something happens to the food, no big deal. So the question is like this. You leave your food there to make your Erev Tchumen, right? You don't really need it. Now, one second. You don't really need it. And I skipped a different step. You're putting the food down there. I said you're putting the food down there. It's holding your food. It's called using a grave. How do you put your Erev Tchumen down in the cemetery at all? The answer is because people put down Erev Tchumen whenever a person made Erev Tchumen. Why do you make it? Typically to do a mitzvah. He wants to go somewhere. He wants to see his Rebbe. It's typically done for the purposes of a mitzvah. Okay, so we have a rule that a mitzvah is not considered having benefit. If you're doing something for a mitzvah or as a mitzvah, it's not called benefit, right? So therefore, putting the Tchumen down there isn't so much a problem. The problem is when you don't need it for the mitzvah anymore, and now you're just storing it there. Now the question is, do you care about this food or not? If after Shabbos begins, I really don't care about this food because I don't really need it anymore, then that's not called that I'm using the grave. But if I do care about the food, and even if I don't need it for the Erev Tchumen anymore, But I care, after Shabbos, I want to take it again. I want to use it again. If you care about the food, then you are using the graves to store your food. So the machlekes here, so when Yehuda says, even in the Beis HaKvaris, he really means anybody can put their eruv down in the Beis HaKvaris. Why? Because after Shabbos begins and I don't need the eruv tchumen anymore, I don't care about the food. If I don't care, it's not called benefiting from the graves. It's not called using the graves. And therefore, you can put it down there. And even if you're a kayin, you can do it, because if you're worried about tumah, don't worry, you'll get into the box and you'll eat it, and you'll be able to enter the cemetery that way. So the fact that he talked about a kayin wasn't because that's because the main discussion is a kayin. It's even a kayin. Even a kayin. And according to the Tanakama, who didn't talk about this, and we assume he argues, he's arguing even by Yisrael. He's arguing even if it's not a kayin. The issue here is not a kayin. Kayin issue is not the kahuna is not an issue here. The issue is, are you called benefiting from the graves? Because he says that even after Shabbos begins and you don't need it for the mitzvah anymore, nonetheless, I want that food. I do care whether it gets eaten up or not. And therefore, it's called that I am using the graves. And therefore, at the end, it would come out that I'm using the graves. So I can't put my eruv tchumen down there at all. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
So you can